Trump says $2,000 checks are coming, and the tone has changed over the last 24 hours. One message from Donald Trump has dominated headlines, live streams, and comment sections across America. This time, it wasn't framed as a suggestion. It wasn't described as a possibility. According to Trump himself, $2,000 checks are coming. In a public statement and a follow-up post on social media, Trump made his position unmistakably clear. He said that low and middle-income Americans will receive a $2,000 payment funded by what he described as massive tariff revenue flowing into the United States from foreign countries. High-income earners, he added, would be excluded. What made this announcement stand out wasn't just the dollar amount. It was the certainty in his language. In the past, Trump talked about rebates, dividends, or checks as ideas. He said they would be nice or that he was considering them. This time, the wording changed. The message was no longer hypothetical. It was direct. You are going to get a check. Trump also went a step further. He said that any tariff revenue left over after the $2,000 payments would be used to pay down the national debt, which now sits at more than $37 trillion. That claim immediately drew attention and skepticism, because while the promise sounds simple, the reality behind it is anything but. Questions about legality, funding, timing, and eligibility surfaced almost instantly. And that's why this story matters, not just because of the money, but because of what's being claimed and what hasn't happened yet. What Trump says, the money is, and where it comes from. After confirming that $2,000 checks are coming, Donald Trump moved quickly to answer the next big question. Where is the money coming from? According to Trump, these payments will not be funded by traditional taxes on Americans. Instead, he says the checks will come from tariff revenue collected from foreign countries. In his words, the United States is taking in massive amounts of money through tariffs, so much so that the government can afford to send checks to its own citizens. Trump has been very clear on one point. This is not a tax cut. It is not a credit. It is not tied to filing status or deductions. He describes it as a direct payment funded by money that comes from outside the country. He also outlined who the payments are meant for. Trump said the $2,000 checks would go to low and middle-income Americans, while high-income earners would be excluded. However, he did not define what high income means. No dollar threshold was provided. No household limits were explained. At the same time, Trump added another promise. He said that any tariff revenue left over after the $2,000 payments would be used to pay down the national debt, which now exceeds $37 trillion. That statement was meant to reassure critics who worry about government spending. But almost immediately, questions began to surface. How much tariff revenue is actually coming in? Is it enough to cover these payments? And who decides how that money can be used? Because while the explanation sounds straightforward, the reality behind tariff revenue is far more complex. And that complexity brings us to the next critical issue, whether this plan can move forward without Congress at all. Why Congress still holds the power of the checkbook. As confident as the promise sounds, there is a major obstacle standing between words and action: the United States Constitution. In America, the power to spend federal money does not belong to the president. It belongs to Congress. This principle is written clearly in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which states that no money can be drawn from the U.S. Treasury unless it has been approved by law. That rule has applied to every major stimulus program in modern history. In 2020, when stimulus checks were sent during the pandemic, Congress passed the legislation. In 2021, when more checks went out, Congress approved those as well. Different presidents, same legal process. This is why many experts are pushing back on Trump's latest claim. Even though the money comes from tariffs, once that revenue is collected, it goes into the U.S. Treasury. At that point, it becomes federal money, subject to congressional authority. Tariff revenue is not a separate account controlled solely by the president. Right now, there is no bill in Congress authorizing $2,000 checks. There is no legislation outlining eligibility, income limits, or payment methods. There is no agency officially tasked with sending the money. That gap is critical. Until Congress acts, this plan remains a political announcement, not a guaranteed program. Lawmakers could support it, modify it, or block it entirely. And without their approval, no checks can legally be issued. Which raises an important question. What happens if Trump tries to move forward anyway? That takes us to the next part of the story, the legal and political storm that could follow. What happens if Trump moves forward without Congress? So what happens if Donald Trump decides not to wait? This is where the situation could turn from a political announcement into a legal confrontation. If Trump were to attempt sending $2,000 checks without congressional approval, the response from Capitol Hill would likely be immediate. Legal experts widely agree that lawsuits would be filed almost instantly. Members of Congress, particularly those opposed to the plan, would argue that the president is violating the Constitution by spending federal revenue without authorization. Their case would be straightforward. Once tariff money enters the Treasury, it becomes public funds, and public funds cannot be spent unilaterally by the executive branch. Courts have consistently defended Congress's power of the purse, regardless of which party controls the White House. Trump, however, could try to defend his actions by pointing to existing trade laws. Certain statutes give presidents broad authority over tariffs, especially during economic or national security emergencies, but using those powers to justify direct cash payments to citizens would be an unprecedented expansion of executive authority. Most constitutional scholars believe a court would step in quickly, likely issuing an injunction to pause any payments while the case is reviewed. But here's where the story takes a political turn. Even if the checks never go out, the conflict itself becomes the headline. Trump could say he tried to deliver money to Americans only to be stopped by Congress or the courts. That narrative is powerful, especially for voters who feel financial pressure. And that leads directly into the next layer of this story, why many analysts believe Trump benefits politically no matter how this plays out, why this promise could be a political win. Either way, at first glance, the $2,000 check looks like a risky promise. The legal questions are serious. The funding is uncertain, and Congress has not acted. Yet many analysts argue that politically, Donald Trump may benefit no matter what happens next. Here's why. If the checks actually go out, Trump claims a direct victory. He becomes the president who delivered cash to millions of Americans at a time when many are still struggling with high prices and financial stress. That kind of outcome is simple, emotional, and powerful. Voters don't analyze the funding source, they remember the relief. But if the checks are blocked, Trump still gains an advantage. If Congress or the courts step in to stop the payments, Trump can point to that resistance and say, "I tried to help you, and they wouldn't let me." In that scenario, the debate shifts away from legality and economics and toward blame. The focus becomes who is helping the people and who is standing in the way. That framing matters. For many Americans, especially those feeling financial pressure, constitutional arguments feel distant. A blocked check feels personal, and Trump's messaging is designed to highlight that contrast. This is why analysts describe the situation as a political win-win. The promise itself creates momentum, the conflict creates headlines, and the issue stays centered on money in people's pockets, not on policy details. But political strategy doesn't change financial reality. Eventually, every promise has to face the numbers. And that brings us to the next unavoidable question. Does the math behind a $2,000 payment actually work? The math behind $2,000 and why experts are concerned. Once the political messaging fades, the next test is simple and unforgiving. The math. Sending a $2,000 check may sound manageable at first. But when you scale it to the size of the United States, the cost grows rapidly. Even if high-income earners are excluded, experts estimate that tens of millions, possibly more than 100 million Americans, would still qualify as low or middle income. At that scale, the total price tag quickly approaches $300 billion or more, and that is a conservative estimate. Now compare that number to the revenue Trump is relying on. According to independent analysts and tax policy experts, recent tariff revenue has generated roughly $90 to $120 billion in net annual income. Even under optimistic assumptions, that figure falls far short of what would be needed to fund nationwide $2,000 payments. There is another issue that complicates the math even further. Tariffs don't operate in isolation. Higher tariffs often reduce imports, slow economic activity, and lower other forms of tax revenue. Some analyses suggest that for every dollar collected through tariffs, the federal government keeps only a fraction after accounting for these economic side effects. In plain terms, the money coming in does not match the money going out. This gap forces a difficult choice. Either the program would have to be scaled back, delayed, or supplemented with additional funding. most likely through borrowing. And once borrowing enters the equation, the nature of the $2,000 check changes completely. It's no longer just about tariffs. It becomes part of a much larger conversation about deficits, debt, and long-term economic impact. That's where the next concern begins. When the money isn't there, borrowing, deficits, and the inflation risk. When revenue falls short, the government has a familiar fallback option: borrowing. If tariff income cannot fully cover the cost of $2,000 checks, the remaining gap would almost certainly be financed through additional federal debt. That means issuing more treasury bills and bonds, essentially borrowing money that must be repaid later with interest. This matters because the United States is already running a historic budget deficit. Federal spending has consistently exceeded revenue by hundreds of billions, and in some years by more than $1 trillion. Adding another large, one-time cash program would increase that pressure even further. Economists warn that borrowing on this scale has consequences that go beyond accounting. When the government injects large amounts of borrowed money into the economy, it increases overall demand. People spend more, businesses raise prices, and if supply cannot keep up, inflation follows. That risk is especially sensitive right now. Over the past few years, Americans have endured high inflation that drove up the cost of food, rent, healthcare, and everyday essentials. The Federal Reserve responded by raising interest rates sharply, slowing economic growth in an effort to bring prices under control. While inflation has cooled somewhat, it remains a concern. Injecting hundreds of billions of dollars through direct payments could reignite price pressures, undoing progress that took years to achieve. For households on fixed incomes, particularly seniors, inflation is not just an economic statistic, it directly erodes purchasing power. A one-time $2,000 check can be helpful, but rising prices can quietly offset that benefit over time. And that raises a key question. Why does this proposal still resonate so strongly with voters despite these risks? Why many Americans still want the $2,000 check? For economists and policy experts, the risks are clear. But for millions of Americans, the conversation looks very different from the kitchen table. To many households, $2,000 is not an abstract number. It represents breathing room. It means catching up on a credit card that's been maxed out since prices went up. It means fixing a car that's needed to get to work. It means paying rent without falling behind again. This is why the $2,000 check still carries such emotional weight. Most people are not thinking about long-term deficit projections or inflation models. They're thinking about today's bills. When financial pressure is constant, immediate relief often feels more important than future risk. There's also a strong sense of fairness driving public support. Many Americans feel they've absorbed years of higher costs, groceries, gas, insurance, healthcare, while hearing about billions flowing through government programs and overseas spending. When they're told that tariff money is being collected from foreign countries, the instinctive reaction is simple. Why shouldn't some of that money come back to us? From that perspective, the $2,000 check feels earned, not given. This is why public opinion remains split. Some voters focus on economic stability and long-term consequences. Others focus on survival and short-term relief. Neither side feels unreasonable from their own position. And politically, this divide is powerful. Because when people are under financial stress, certainty today often beats caution about tomorrow. That tension is exactly what makes this proposal so effective and so controversial at the same time. A nation divided, belief, skepticism, and trust. As news of the $2,000 check spread, one thing became immediately clear. America is deeply divided. In comment sections, live streams, and social media posts, reactions split almost evenly. Some people responded with excitement and hope. Others responded with doubt, frustration, and disbelief. Supporters say this time feels different. They point to Trump's confident tone and repeated confirmation. To them, this no longer sounds like an idea being tested. It sounds like a promise already decided. Many write simply, yes, it's real, and say they're counting on it. But skeptics are just as vocal. They remember past proposals that never materialized, the so-called dividend ideas that generated headlines, stirred expectations, and then quietly disappeared. For them, strong language doesn't equal certainty. Until Congress passes a law and checks are actually sent, they see no reason to believe. There is also confusion fueling the divide. Early comments from Treasury officials suggested the $2,000 might come through tax changes rather than cash. That contradiction forced Trump to clarify publicly that these would be actual checks. Even now, details remain missing: income thresholds, timing, and legal approval. At its core, this divide is about trust. Some Americans trust the message, others trust the process, and right now, the message is far ahead of the process. That gap explains why emotions are running so high. For people under financial pressure, belief brings hope. For those burned before, skepticism feels like protection. And that leads directly to the next question many viewers are asking. If this were to happen, when would the money actually arrive? The timing question. When would the money actually arrive? After the excitement, the debate, and the division, one practical question keeps coming up again and again. When would Americans actually get the $2,000 check? Right now, there is no answer. Despite the confident language used by Donald Trump, no payment date has been announced. There is no timeline, no rollout schedule, and no official confirmation of which government agency would be responsible for sending the money. That uncertainty is not a small detail. It's a major signal. In previous stimulus programs, timelines were announced only after Congress passed legislation. The Treasury Department and the IRS were formally instructed. Systems were prepared. Even then, it took weeks or months for payments to reach everyone. None of that has happened here. At the moment, there is no bill moving through Congress, no appropriation has been approved, and no legal authority has been granted to distribute funds. Without those steps, checks cannot be printed, deposited, or mailed, regardless of how confident the promise sounds. Legal challenges could also delay things further. As long as the courts are reviewing the legality of Trump's tariffs, lawmakers may be reluctant to approve payments tied to revenue that could later be ruled invalid. This is why financial experts urge caution. A promise without a process does not equal a payment. Until timelines are announced through official channels, Americans should not plan around receiving this money. And that leads to another important clarification: what this $2,000 is and what it is not. Why Trump keeps saying checks, not tax cuts. One detail Donald Trump has emphasized repeatedly is easy to miss, but critically important. He does not describe this $2,000 as a tax break. He calls it a check. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Early on, even officials within the Treasury Department appeared unsure how the $2,000 would be delivered. Some suggested it might come through tax relief, policies like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, or changes to Social Security taxation. Those ideas reduce what people owe, but they do not put cash directly into bank accounts. Trump stepped in to clarify the message. He said plainly that this is money being sent out, not money being forgiven. In other words, Americans would receive cash first, and only after that would any remaining tariff revenue be used for other purposes, such as paying down the national debt. For many Americans, especially seniors, retirees, and lower-income households, this difference is crucial. A tax cut helps only if you owe taxes. A check helps immediately, regardless of income level or tax liability. But cash payments also raise the stakes. Checks require clear eligibility rules. They require verification systems. They require legal authority, and they require administrative coordination. None of those elements have been announced yet. By insisting on checks instead of tax relief, Trump raises expectations dramatically. A check is visible, it's measurable, and if it doesn't arrive, the disappointment is immediate. That's why this detail has drawn so much attention, because once people are told to expect cash, anything less feels like a broken promise. And that leads directly to the next unresolved issue: who exactly would qualify and who might be excluded? Who qualifies and who is still left in the dark? As the promise of $2,000 checks grows louder, one of the most important questions remains unanswered: who exactly would qualify? Donald Trump has repeatedly stated that the payments would go to low and middle-income Americans while high-income earners would be excluded. But beyond that broad description, no concrete details have been provided. There is no income cutoff, no household limit, and no clarification on how eligibility would be determined. This uncertainty is especially significant for seniors. Many retirees rely primarily on Social Security, pensions, or modest retirement savings. Some have little or no taxable income. Would they be considered low income? Middle income? Trump has not said. There has also been no guidance on whether people who do not regularly file tax returns would automatically qualify. Families are asking their own questions. Would dependents be included? Would children receive partial payments as they did in previous stimulus programs? Again, there are no answers yet. In past stimulus efforts, Congress spelled out these rules in detail. Income thresholds were written into law, phase-outs were clearly defined, and the IRS was tasked with administering the program. None of that structure exists here. This lack of clarity creates mixed emotions. Some Americans assume they will qualify and are already counting on the money. Others worry they may be excluded, especially after hearing that high-income households will receive nothing without knowing where that line is drawn. Until legislation exists, eligibility remains speculation, and that uncertainty leads directly to the next issue experts continue to raise: whether this proposal can survive the legal and economic hurdles ahead. Why experts say this is still a political idea, not a policy. Despite the confidence in Donald Trump's language, many economists and legal experts continue to emphasize one critical point. This plan does not yet exist as a policy. Right now, there is no bill, no vote, no appropriated funding, and no formal authorization to send $2,000 checks to anyone. What exists is a public promise, repeated forcefully, but still disconnected from the legal process required to make it real. Experts point to three major obstacles standing in the way. First, Congress has not acted. Without legislation, there is no mechanism to distribute funds, no enforcement of eligibility rules, and no protection against legal challenges. Second, the funding source is uncertain. Tariff revenue fluctuates year to year. It depends on trade volume, economic conditions, and ongoing court decisions. Relying on that revenue for a nationwide cash program adds instability to an already fragile equation. Third, the courts are still involved. The Supreme Court is reviewing aspects of Trump's tariff authority. A ruling against the tariffs could reduce revenue sharply or eliminate it altogether. That risk alone makes lawmakers hesitant to approve payments tied directly to tariff income. Because of these hurdles, analysts caution Americans not to treat the $2,000 check as guaranteed. Strong messaging can shape expectations, but it does not replace the legislative process. In other words, what voters are hearing right now is a political commitment, not an operational plan. And that distinction matters, especially for people making financial decisions based on what they believe is coming next. Which brings us to the final stretch of this story: what this all means for everyday Americans right now. The long-term cost: debt today, pressure tomorrow. If the $2,000 checks were ever approved and sent, the story would not end when the money hits bank accounts. In many ways, that's when the real consequences would begin. Large cash payments do not disappear after they are spent. If tariff revenue falls short, as many experts expect, the remaining cost would likely be covered through additional federal borrowing. That borrowing adds to a national debt that is already historically high. Over time, higher debt means higher interest payments. Those payments compete with funding for other priorities: healthcare, infrastructure, and social programs that many Americans depend on. Once locked in, debt limits flexibility for years, sometimes decades. There is also the inflation risk. Even a one-time surge of cash can raise demand across the economy. When demand rises faster than supply, prices adjust upward. For working families, that can mean higher costs. For retirees and seniors on fixed incomes, it can mean something more serious: a permanent loss of purchasing power. Social Security cost of living adjustments help, but they often lag behind real-world expenses. Rent, groceries, and medical costs tend to rise first. By the time benefits adjust, households have already absorbed the hit. This is why economists warn that short-term relief can come with long-term pressure. The $2,000 check may feel helpful in the moment, but the trade-off can show up quietly, month after month, in higher everyday costs. That doesn't mean relief is always wrong. It means how it's funded matters, and who ultimately pays matters just as much as who receives the check. Which brings us to the final question: how should Americans think about this promise right now? The bottom line: promises, process, and personal caution. At the end of this long and emotional debate, the most important thing to understand is simple: a promise is not the same as a guarantee. Donald Trump has been clear in his messaging. He says $2,000 checks are coming. He says the money will come from tariffs, and he says it will help millions of Americans who are struggling with higher costs. That message is confident, direct, and powerful. But confidence alone does not move money. For these checks to become real, several things still have to happen. Congress would need to act. Legal questions around tariff authority would need to be resolved. Funding gaps would need to be addressed. And a clear, lawful process would need to be put in place to decide who qualifies and how payments are delivered. Until those steps occur, the $2,000 check remains a political commitment, not a financial certainty. For everyday Americans, especially seniors, retirees, and people on fixed incomes, the practical takeaway is caution. Do not plan your budget around money that has not been approved. Do not make financial decisions based on announcements alone. Stay informed, but stay grounded. If a check does arrive one day, it can provide short-term relief, but it should be treated as a bonus, not a foundation. Long-term stability comes from careful planning, not from campaign promises. In times like these, understanding the difference between what is said and what is done matters more than ever. Because when the headlines fade, what remains is your financial security, and that is worth protecting.